So 5 C's for success in genealogy today. These are principles applicable anywhere you do research. So think about them in relationship to your brick walls and your problem ancestral families. The 5 C's are that you combine classic with computer resources. Those are your first 2 C's, and we'll give you an actual example of how this works. Collaborating with cousins is the next C. Then cite sources consistently. Probably the single thing that scares or genealogists hesitate to comply with is to cite their sources. So I'll give you some tips to help you in this area. And then finally, comprehensive searching. This class today is about going beyond the average so you can find more. And so we are ready to tackle the 5 C's. Now, probably all of you know or have already realized that the things that are online for you to search easily from home in your pajamas and bunny slippers are only the tip of the iceberg, a small percentage of the actual records out there for you to go find. But you often use the internet to find where those classic records are, and you also often will use internet resources like wikis and tutorials like at the BYU Genealogy Center, Family History Center. They have wonderful handwriting tutorials. So you're going to use computer resources to help you, much as you're using the wiki today to help you interpret what you find. So how to identify an end-of-line ancestor? In this case, we're going to take one of my ancestors, Martha Gray, and we're looking for her parents. I and more than a half a dozen researchers have been working on this for almost 30 years. No one has been able to identify Martha's parents. So now we're going to take the next step beyond to put a little more energy and effort into it. Martha was born in 1784 in Virginia. The 1850 census, family Bibles, other sources give us her birth date and location. Her children's 1880 census records saying where the mother and father were born, these types of records. She married Edmund Gross in 1800 in Washington County, Virginia. And so we have the beginning of the timeline of the places where she resided, which begins in Washington County, Virginia. You will want to, on your research problems, think about making a geographic timeline, one tracing the different places the person or family you're researching lived, maybe where their children and grandchildren, some of their descendants lived, maybe even some of their collaterals, the people who were witnesses on their marriages or the people who were witnesses on their land records. So track where they lived. These types of timelines for residents can be very, very helpful, as you'll see in our example as we go forward. Now, by 1805, Martha and her husband Edmund were living in what became Campbell County, Tennessee. And that goes on to the timeline. And I'll make a list of questions that will help me address this problem. And maybe the first question for finding her parents would be, how did Edmund Gross meet and court Martha Gray? This is a principle called propinquity. You have to meet someone to get to know them, to marry them. There are very few royal marriages in your family trees, typically. They have to meet and court. And so we can establish during the period of time how likely they were to be living close together. For instance, if it was during the late 1700s, early 1800s, it's quite likely that they would have been within either walking distance or maybe with a horse, say 9 to 15 miles. Once the train, the railroad came to town, that changes. So we need to look at maps. We need to look and find out what the migration routes were in the area, what the roads were. So add this to your timeline as well. When did these significant transportation venues come into play in the area where you're researching? Now, one of our classic tools here in the U.S. is the Handy Book for Genealogists. Mine sits right where I can reach it next to me at my main computer on a bookshelf. And if you look in the map for the area, Washington County, Virginia, where they lived and were married in 1800, this is the map of the counties as they are today, and that's very important to remember. This is what they were like today. When I'm doing this research problem, I'm going to pull up a tool like AnyMap, which is the U.S. County Boundary Historical Atlas. It was on CD originally. And I'll pull it up, and I'll see that in 1800, this was the county structure. This is the type of tool either that you have in your home on a CD or you may have online that you will go to for your area, your ancestors' area, and look at the geopolitical structure at that time. Washington County extended into a good portion of Lee County, Russell County, Grayson County. So there it is, as it was in 1800. You want to not just let these things sit in the book or sit on the computer screen. You're going to want to do captures of them so you can put them side by side to compare, to have them at hand as you go forward now and tackle various record types researching in this area. So keep that in mind. I went to Google Maps when I was digging in and trying to solve this problem. I knew that there was a Grosses Mountain in the area. I'd visited the area, and there was a rusty iron mountain because the Grosses had iron mills. And so there was Grosses Mountain all rusty with iron. They had arrived, the Grosses, in this area in 1769, fairly early for this particular location. And there was a Grosses Mountain to be seen from their property. Also, they lived on Grosses Creek, and again, Google Maps helps you pinpoint that. And you look at some of the zoom in, zoom out, look at some of the other places in that area and the names are named for, because these often reflect the early settlers and people the Grosses may have known. We're looking for Grays because Edmund Gross married a Martha Gray. So I would click on the Terrain tab, and all of a sudden I can see here is Grosses Creek, and the lower red circle is Grosses Mountain, part of the Iron Mountains, not surprisingly. The nearest habitation is Chilhowie, which is in Smith County, Virginia now. And somebody can always correct my pronunciation of these things later. Smith or Smythe? I think the locals call it Smith, but I've been corrected by the best. Barbara Vines Little has corrected my pronunciation for, I called it Vodotort because it looked like court, but Barbara corrected me. She's one of the premier Virginia researchers. And she says, no, Barbara, it's Botetourt, Botetourt. And down in North Carolina, Jolynn White corrected me, it's not Rowan, it's Rowan. Get the syllabation right. If you get the accent right, the locals will understand you better. So these are the places in relationship to where Edmund Gross lived. But where are the Grays? There are no Grays in this area. So looking at the topography, here's where Edmund Gross at least was living in 1800 when he married. And then in 1805, here is the migration route, again using the free Google Maps tool. And here's where they settled, again up against the mountains, which were an iron source. So the migration down the valley there, or up the valley, depending on the direction the water flows, and this would be down the valley in this case, is logical. It seems logical. You'd look for perhaps the Grays along the way. So here is a map I've drawn of about a 9-mile perimeter using the key and giving me a size for the map. And this is where Edmund was living in 1800, and in Washington County, Virginia, this is where you would expect to find the Grays. But looking down the valley topographically, there are no Grays living in Virginia at that time. Simply none. Now notice the circle. Everybody look at the corner. The dotted line reflects the corner of Tennessee and a northwestern corner of North Carolina. But there are so many mountain ranges in between that I didn't really think they had that much of a mountain goat gene in the family, that they would have been from that tiny little sliver of a corner. So I concentrated on the valley and the migration pattern, as did most of the other researchers for years. So going back to the map here, you can see that that circle for propinquity, where he likely would have met and married and courted to marry Martha Gray. You have Ashe County, North Carolina, and you have Johnson and Carty County, Tennessee, where there's a lot of iron forge activity in the late 1700s. So we're looking at these areas. Now I want to go into Ancestry.com or some other tool that will give you an idea of what is the distribution of that name, the last name Gray, in that county where they got married. This is one of the ways you can go in and find out who's there. Tax lists, census records, property listings in other countries. So look for the types of records that give you an idea of who else with that name would have been living in that area. I searched and it found 0 good matches in Washington County, Virginia at that time. There were no Grays with alternate spellings, A or an E, in those census lists, in the tax lists I looked in the area, in the land records. In fact, the only Gray family I found in Washington County, Virginia were 2 brothers who had served in the Revolutionary War, and their families were well documented. They migrated down into Sullivan County, Tennessee, from Washington County, which makes sense. The state border is not the Great Wall of China. So that was a very logical migration path down the valley. So looking at that area in Washington County, Virginia, where they were living, where they likely met, didn't solve the problem. So we go on and formulate the next question for our research. What resources can be used to sort the Grays in early Campbell County, Tennessee, the next place on your timeline of residence, into groups? Because we want to see if there is a group of Grays there. If you're lucky, there may be one group which will give you a high probability. Unfortunately, in my case, not only did they burn the courthouse down in Campbell County, Tennessee 2 or 3 times, but there are several groups of Grays in that particular location. One thing you can do when you're researching in a new location is to go into the library or archive that handles that jurisdiction and see what records they have. In this case, they show records in Campbell County, Tennessee, tax records for 1838 and 1839, right here. And that, you would think, from looking at this archives listing online, would be the earliest records for that location. Unfortunately, that is not totally true. There are fragmentary lists for different counties in Tennessee, East Tennessee particularly, that have been extracted and indexed and published in books over the years. I just happen to have 3 books about early Tennessee tax lists sitting on the shelf of my office here. Now, if you can't use tax lists in your location, you might try an alternate record, like land records. This happens to come from the Family Search Library catalog. And many of you would go in and look at this catalog and see that it says an index from 1804 to 1890, and then here are deeds D through G. Wait a minute, if you look closely, there's a comma there. D, comma, G. The next entry below has a hyphen, I through K. But what has happened in this case in Campbell County is that some of the land record books were missing. As a side note, simply because the largest genealogy library in the world, the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, that this catalog is from, doesn't have all those deed volumes, doesn't mean they don't exist. It simply means that is what they filmed at the time they visited that courthouse. I happen to know several people in the local historical society. I'm a member of the Campbell County, Tennessee Historical Society as well. And I was there visiting a couple years ago, and they excitedly came out and said, Barbara, look, somebody turned in one of the missing land record books. We have photocopied it and sent the original on to Nashville, to the State Library and Archive, to be filmed. And so that may yet change their listing as they microfilm the record and preserve it. But records do turn up. Just simply because you find a family history, the Family Search Library catalog, or another catalog somewhere in the world that says these are our holdings, doesn't mean those are a complete listing of what that particular geopolitical jurisdiction has.